Hello, everyone, and welcome to our electric vehicle event tonight. We're here on behalf of the Western Alliance for Greenhouse Action. This is a collaborative council event, and we'll be hearing from Bryce Gatton in just a moment. My name is Brendan, and I work for Moonee Valley City Council. But just before we kick off, I do a quick acknowledgement of country. I would like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land which I'm working today, the Maribyrnong people of the Kulin Nation. I pay respect to their spirits, ancestors, elders, and their community members past and present. I also extend this respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who may be joining us in this webinar. Just a quick note that this webinar is being recorded, and you'll notice there is a chat function at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Simply click on that icon to use the chat. There's also a Q&A function on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Simply click on the icon to open the window, type in your question and press enter. You can also upvote questions by pressing the thumbs up icon. There's also the raise hand function. This is in the middle of the bottom bar to indicate that you would like assistance from tech support. And so I'll quickly do an intro here for Bryce Gatton, who'll be speaking in a moment. Bryce has been working in, as well as writing and presenting to the EV sector since 2008. His current roles involve writing for Australia's premier EV news site, The Driven, running the EV transition support consultancy EV Choice, and providing EV build safety training to a number of Australian university FSAE race teams. In his spare time, Bryce writes on EV topics for a new magazine, as well as regularly presenting on EV issues and opportunities at conferences and information forums. He is also the writer behind the EV car model fact sheets and webpage found on the Australian Electric Vehicle Association website. And so now I'll pass you over to Bryce.
Thank you for that introduction, Brendan. I'll now hopefully get the, the sharing of the screen across. I've had one glitch in sharing since starting in webinars many years ago. So we had one glitch the last time I did a presentation, which was rather scary. So today I'm hoping very strongly that this works. So how is that to Brendan? Is that able to be seen by everybody?
Yep, that's coming up for me.
I'm getting over my terrors from last time. And welcome to everyone here. A quick note to everyone here today. The version of the presentation will be made available at the end. I'll be emailing them out if people want them. There'll be an email address popping up in the chat fairly soon, and I'll also put it in the last slide today. So give you a rough rundown of what I'm going to do today. I'll talk about some of the jargon and acronyms that we in the EV area tend to use. So hopefully you'll get a bit of an understanding of some of the PEVs and FEVs and BEVs that people keep talking about and wondering what they are. I'll give a brief history of the EV because it's not a new phenomenon. It's been around a while. Talk a bit about how EVs are evolving and developing in Australia. Talk a bit more about when might be the time to choose an EV for yourself, which is generally, if and when one actually turns up that suits your needs. And that's a growing number of EVs. So the if is probably dying off and when is getting closer. And I'll give you a series of information sources about where you can find good, dispassionate information about EVs. So first up, I'm going to talk about what is an EV. First two there, the PEV, plug-in electric vehicles. The simplest one is the full battery electric vehicle. It has a battery, electric motor, and as you electric motor drives the wheels, and as you slow down, that regenerative effect from the braking puts some energy back into the battery. And that means you can save between about 5 and 20% of the energy used accelerating and driving to slow the car down and put it back into the battery, which is saving the sort of energy that's used to waste in wearing out your brakes. In the FEV, the plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, they have been a fairly good interim technology, although as the BEVs are coming down in price, which I'll talk more about later, the FEVs overseas are actually starting to fall off a cliff in numbers, and the BEVs are now well and truly outnumbering sales in much more mature markets than we have here yet. Even in Australia, by the way, in the last few months, the FEVs have started dropping off markedly as the BEVs are getting cheaper and cheaper, which I'll also talk about it soon. They're your PEVs, your plug-in vehicles. They're the ones that will basically make it over the line when the bans on selling of internal combustion engine passenger and like commercial vehicles start coming into play. The hybrid electric vehicle, although it is an electric car, this is your Toyota Prius, Toyota Camrys, those type of things, they don't have a plug. They can't be recharged, and when they run out of fuel, they stop. So they're effectively a petrol car with a energy saving device with electric battery and motor. That's your HEV. And then you have your alternate name is the hydrogen car, but generally I call them a fuel cell EV or FCEV. They use hydrogen in a chemical reaction to create electricity, with the waste product being water, which is very nice. And that's in a fuel cell. And then you can accelerate and decelerate gently using hydrogen, or if you need to accelerate quickly or do regenerative braking, you need that battery still. So you don't get rid of the battery. They're a bit like a PHEV. As I'll talk about later, they are very expensive technology. They have energy issues, and there's almost nowhere you can refuel them. Even in Australia, we have 4 places we can refuel them at the moment. Coming back to that one a little bit later, though, EVs are not a new phenomenon. This is a 1906 EV. As you notice, it's that old, it has a tiller rather than a steering wheel. And this lovely lady is just demonstrating just how easy it is to plug in and recharge. In those days, electricity was confined to the biggest cities of the world and generally only the very central part of the business district. And electricity was a long way away from coming to the outer areas and the country. Whereas it came to petrol cars, you could take a 2-gallon tin anywhere. They could also accelerate to higher speeds and go for slightly longer. So the petrol car in those days won. There was, by the way, another car, and selling in roughly equal numbers at the time, between petrol, electric, and the third one, steam. They actually were steam cars. They died away mainly because it took about 45 minutes to warm up. People actually really liked the electric cars to begin with because you didn't have to hand crank them. They weren't smelly and noisy and didn't scare horses. As I said, they had some technology issues. The lead acid batteries gave them anything between 20 to 40 miles of range. So the technology wasn't quite there, but they didn't go away, and they have been bubbling along in the background ever since. And the new generation electric vehicles have started in the late 90s, early 2000s, and we have seen much more in the 2010s and on. The technology has definitely matured, and we're getting the sort of ranges, acceleration, longevity of the cars that are now exceeding that of an internal combustion engine or ICE car. Eva, by the way, I often talk about cars because that's my general focus, but it's not just cars. If we're going to get off our fossil fuel addictions, we need to get all transport off carbon-based fuels, and that means trucks will do it. Those two there, the middle one is the Tesla truck that is now starting to be sold in America. That's a 37-ton semi-trailer. You can get conversion trucks of about 10, 16, 20 sort of ton vehicles like that Iveco there. That's a company here in Victoria that does those conversions of new or relatively new vehicles to electric. I'm looking forward to the electric rubbish truck when it comes. It'll be a damn sight quieter than the big noisy vroom, vroom, as they speed up and slow down around the place. Yes, electric mining machinery is a thing, and these are the sort of things that are starting to come out. Obviously a lot safer underground because there's no fumes to be put out. Yes, farm machinery is on its way, and don't forget the electric bobcat there that was displayed January last year, and production will be coming around sometime in the next year or two. That tractor, by the way, will be available 2026, they're talking. And who hasn't tried to be run over by an electric Deliveroo or scooter on the road lately? So personal transport is also electrifying. Motorbikes, that picture is in fact the Harley Davidson Livewire, and there's a number of them getting around now. There's one at the Swinburne Uni fast charger that I often see charging there. And yes, electric planes are a thing. That little flight trainer, that little Cessna-like thing there, is a flight trainer that there's a number of them around the world. There's actually a fleet of them here in Australia. I think it's in West Australia at the moment. That second one there, that's called the Alice and is in flight trials, and that's a 9-seater plane. If I start talking about the bans coming a bit later in this presentation on internal combustion engines, Norway set 2025 as the end date for internal combustion engine passenger and light commercial vehicles. And they also say that by 2040, all local or short-haul short-haul flights must be electric. There's single-person electric flying cars, as you might call them, vertical takeoff and landing. That one's for sale in America called the Black Fly. It's certainly worth looking up on the web. Autonomous cars, that's built here in Victoria, in Croydon. AEV is the company. They're trialling that. That ultimately will become a autonomous last mile vehicle that you can just hop in once you come out of the train station and take you to your bus or whatever station, and take you to your last destination. Buses are a very big thing overseas, and I keep referring back to a city in China. I can't remember the name of it, but it changed its whole fleet of 10,000 buses to electric and is doing very well. Electric ferries, yes, they do exist. So watercraft do exist, little boats and things as well, but that is a big electric ferry. Takes several hundred passengers, quite a number of cars, and does a regular run between ports in the Scandinavian countries. And of course, there's the general equipment. The councils love these particular ride-on lawnmowers. They'll ride all day up to about 7 hours of mowing, and then they recharge overnight on a normal power point. Or if you have a electric ute like the Rivian that I'll talk about a bit later, or the Ford F-150 Lightning, you can just plug it into that and recharge. Transitions, by the way, are not something that's happening like all of a sudden now. They have happened all the time when technology comes along. These are the famous two photos that the number of presenters use, and I've shamelessly swiped them, although I've actually found the actual sources of them, unlike a lot of people, but that's a long story. In that one, you'll see 1900, there was one horseless carriage and all the rest were horse-drawn carriages. In 1913, so bare 13 years later, you can just see the tail of a horse and one carriage there, and everything else on Fifth Avenue is a horseless carriage. You can see there's a hell of a lot more of them probably than in vehicles than there was in 1900. So people really took to the car when it came, and that's what happens in any technology transition. People really enjoy the new technology and start taking it up with gusto. And that's the sort of thing there you'll see. Every new technology has sort of a slow uptake at the beginning, a really steep uptake in the middle there, and then as people finally get it on board, the last people buy it, that's at the end. If you're feeling really bored, ourworldindata.org is a good way of sort of tracing the history of many of the technology changes that have happened in the last century or more. By the way, that looks familiar. That is in fact the uptake curve of electric vehicles in the world up to the end of 2021. By the way, that has now worldwide reached something in the order of 12-13%. Australia in 2019 was 0.6%. We last month hit, I think, 8.7%. So we might have been a bit slow to begin with, but we're catching up fast. Bit more acronyms and terminology. EVSE, electric vehicle supply equipment, commonly called a car charger. I won't go more into much more detail about how they work and things, but the whole deal is you'll generally get one with the car. That's that top left one on your screen. That's the sort of thing that comes with the car. There are 1 or 2 cars that don't come with them. A lot of commercial vehicles don't, because you want a 3-phase one, and they're quite more expensive than those. The one below there is one I have for long distance travels. I occasionally call myself jokingly the third Leyland brother, because I keep wandering outside of the DC networks. And that one is very handy, because I'll do up to a 32 amp 3-phase outlet, and I can set the charge accordingly. But that's your portable ones that will plug in. Then you have your fixed ones. They're the sort of things you'll have at home. That Tesla one there is a typical tethered lead one, but lots of other chargers, generic ones, will do the same thing. For home use, I often recommend, in fact, I always recommend using a tethered lead, because you just unplug it and coil it up and off you go. You have a BYO lead, but bring your own lead, the one there. Councils and public chargers like that for AC charging, because you bring your own lead and you have to look after it rather than the council having to inspect it every so often and test it or replace it. Or the people cut it off because they want the copper. So that's the common one that you'll be seeing in public use, and for your private use, be a tethered lead. So when you're using public ones, if you use public ones, you just carry your own lead. They're about $200 to $250. Actually, I even saw them in Bunnings the other day for about $300. So it's pretty easy to get them. On the other hand, if you're going interstate or in country and you're wanting to get a fast charger on the road, this is where the old roadhouses come in. This is your DC fast charger, and that feeds DC current directly to the battery. Those first ones I showed you, basically they take power from a power point, feed it to the car, and in the car there's a conversion from AC to DC. So that conversion happens in the car. So theoretically, the charger is actually built into the car for those AC ones, whereas the DC ones are true chargers because they actually provide DC to the battery. Those two there, that orange one is Australian made, and it'll do up to 50 kilowatts. And I'll talk more about that in a moment, but that green one there will do up to 350. Comparing that to the little one at the far top left of your screen, that will do 1.8 to 2 kilowatts. So 2 into 350 is whatever it is, half of 350, 175 times faster. As you can guess, they're pretty fast. And I'll give you some times about that a little bit later. By the way, a lot of people keep going, oh, maybe I won't buy an EV yet. The plugs aren't sorted. Well, I'll let you into a secret. The plug war's over. This is what was around in maybe 2017. Australia has pretty much, or has settled on that, the CCS2 combo system. So the top part of it, of that plug, is the AC side, 3 phases if you use it, or otherwise you just use a single phase like a house. And the bottom, the 2 big pins that are added is when you do that DC fast charge stuff. In North America, there were 2 competing standards. As you'll see there, the Type 1 CCS and the Tesla plug. I'll come back to that in a moment, because the next one I'm going to mention is the Tesla's Model S and X, which is similar to the Type 2 plug. In fact, it will plug into a Type 2 quite easily, but they modified it to do DC through it as well. We don't see those anymore. We no longer get the Models S and X in Australia, so they're a legacy plug now. On the Tesla Model 3s and Ys use that CCS2 plug. And that was starting before in North America. Just in the last few weeks to a month, all the manufacturers, apart from Tesla, were using that CCS1, but they all just jumped on board the Tesla plug. So that doesn't exist anymore going forward, and they've all jumped onto what's now called the NACS, or North American Charging Standard. So that's that one on the far right. To go to the next one, we will never see that plug here, because that's designed for the peculiar American or North American charging system. It's a single phase system, so it just doesn't suit what the rest of the world has, which has a 3-phase system. Hence, CCS2 will dominate the rest of the world, and all of Europe and most of the rest of the world uses that CCS2, except for Japan, who rather like their Type 1 because it has a similar power system to America. Except pretty much all the cars that are brought here now, the Nissan Leaf has the Type 2 plug, but it still has that big CHAdeMO. And only the private imports of the Japanese cars will have that one now. So we won't see that particular pairing anymore, except for the private imports of the Japanese Leafs and what have you. In fact, Nissan Leaf, which still comes with that big CHAdeMO DC socket at the bottom, is changing to the CCS2 when the Aria arrives, as is the Lexus. The Lexus 300E has the CHAdeMO, the new Lexus, as will the Toyota and things. So even the Japanese manufacturers outside of Japan are bringing the CCS2. So as I said, the plug war is over. Type 2 is the one. So if you're hanging off buying an EV on that basis, we're already there. I often get asked about bidirectional charging in terms of when I can get power out of my car as well as just feeding it in. There's a few acronyms here that get involved. Vehicle to load, V2L, that's where you can plug an adapter in and get 240 volts out. And there's already a lot of CCS2 cars that do it. The Kia EV6 and the Hyundai Ioniq 5, for instance, are built on the same platform, by the way. They'll give you 15 amps. And I've actually borrowed a Kia EV6 for some events where we've run a large barbecue, an electric barbecue, a induction cooktop, and LED lighting at night. And it ran it quite happily. I had plenty of charge to get from Melbourne to Euroa and back, including running that setup for about 4 hours. For camping, they definitely don't ruin the long weekend. They enhance it. V2H, or vehicle to home, this is where you can feed power to your house, and there's a special setup in the switchboard, that will actually allow you to power the house and disconnect it from the grid while it's doing so. That is available in the CHAdeMO plug, but because the CHAdeMO plug is now a legacy plug, even though the systems are available overseas and they've been trialed here, they're only being trialed in order to test how to do bidirectional charging. They're not being trialed to sell those CHAdeMO systems here, because pretty much there won't be any CHAdeMO cars arriving. V2G is basically feeding it both to the house and to the grid, and that will be coming as well when the vehicle to home systems start becoming available, and they'll be able to do either of those two things. If you're wondering if you've seen that, V2X is basically vehicle to something. That's sort of the grab-all term for all those three. Now, as I said, the CHAdeMO plug does it, but it lost the plug war, the CCS1. So CHAdeMO was designed from the very beginning in Japan in 2012 to do that because they were afraid of tsunamis, earthquakes, all that types of things. So they wanted to make sure that they had backup power. CCS wasn't designed with that in mind, but it is now. So hence the vehicle to load is now available, and what's coming soon in the next, that's a CCS plug, by the way, in my car. And it's being developed to do it. Some have already do it, as I said, the vehicle to load. And By 2025-26, you'll be actually able to buy the box and have a car that will do those two things. The first of the V2X capable cars for the CCS system will be arriving late this year, but the supply authorities won't allow those to be connected. They'll then start trolling them. So, and have agreed to get back together to have the discussions about smart charging and having grid talking to the charger and the charger talking to the grid in 2025. And they'll start agreeing on a connection system. And then 2026 and beyond will be when you can buy that system. So if anybody asks me about that in the chat, my short answer is 2026. When it comes to refueling an EV, that's probably the big mindset change. When it comes to petrol cars, we're used to that. We are used to building in a detour to fill in our car and building the time for that petrol refill or that diesel refill. So that's what we're used to. And it's just that extra time spent occasionally pulling in and detouring, what have you. For an electric car, our destination becomes our refueling point. We don't have to make, for virtually all of our charging, so it's around town, we don't need to stop at a petrol station like petrol pump. We can use those AC chargers, which take a little bit longer to charge because the car does its thing while we're doing ours. To overnight charge, I say my charge takes 20 seconds. I get home in the evening, plug it in, 10 seconds. I unplug it in the morning when I'm leaving, another 10 seconds. So it's 20 seconds. The time in between is irrelevant because I'm sleeping, car's doing its thing. And the same thing happens if you're at the library or the shops or at work or at the park. You can be there for several hours and it will just do a thing and you can top up or get a full recharge depending on what you need and what time you have available. You don't have to charge it all up at once. So as I said, that paradigm is different, and this is where the mental shift happens, where it's a plug and ignore mobile phone model where you just let it do its thing, not standing around and acting as a fuel pump attendant. Now the question is always being asked, how fast do I need to charge? If you're doing less than 100 kilometers a day, an ordinary power point, that one that comes with the car, the charger, will do the job. You'll get an overnight charge, 2 kilowatts-ish, a charge in less than 8 hours to replenish that 100 Ks. It's pretty straightforward, pretty easy. You wouldn't have to add any more, but you do need to put in a separate power point for the car. It's just good practice, and I'm actually involved in teaching a course to electricians. I was involved in designing as well, and that's basically explaining that the standards require you to put in a full separate circuit, and it's about $500 just to add a power point where you need it. It needs to be on its own circuit. By the way, don't use extension leads for charging unless you really have to, and have a good quality extension lead, and only use it once off in an emergency because they melt. And that's an example of a friend that was using a 15 amp outlet and was regularly charging when he was visiting some friends when he was staying there on weekends. It happened pretty fast in 1 or 2 charging events. It just cascaded into that melt. So yes, good quality plugs, check if they're getting warm, preferably never use extension leads. If you're doing several hundred Ks in a day and want to get a bigger charge, it's quite straightforward, but you put in your slightly more robust, beefier, dedicated charger, and that just bolts to the wall. That will give you 32 amps. That's on a single phase house, and that will give me my car 0 to 100%. So in 9 hours, I'll have my car fully charged. By the way, even at 15 amps, as we'll talk about in a minute. So caravan parks and EVs are a marriage made in heaven because you'll get pretty much most of a charge if you're on a long weekend drive. And they're about $1,500 up installed. The units start about $800 up from there. And you can buy all singing, all dancing ones. I want to say just get a basic one at the moment and wait for the true smart chargers to arrive in 2025, 26, because that's when you'll be able to do grid control, good tariffs being offered to you because you can have your charging managed by the grid. You might get some very cheap charging because they've got too much power and they'll actually give you free charging. That is quite possible. So here's those numbers that I was talking about a bit earlier. I'll just pull that little one up there. 10 amp power point, that's your normal everyday power point. If it's set at 2.4 kilowatts, which is 10 amps, that will give you 16 kilometers charged. Now, most of those portable ones that come with the car are set for about 1.8 kilowatts, and they'll give you 12 kilometers charged an hour. So obviously it's a bit slow, but if you're desperate, you just happen to run out of charge, which is pretty hard to do in an EV. It bings and bongs and gives you all sorts of warnings for a very long time. And even when it says it's empty, it will limp along for another couple of Ks to get you there. Unlike a petrol car that when it runs out, it's run out. So that's sort of numbers you get. So if you really needed to get to a faster charger and getting low, plug in your portable charger. 6 or 10 Ks is probably more than enough to get you to a proper faster charger, which would be something like your home charger down the bottom. Most cars these days will do up to 11 kilowatts 3-phase AC charging. That's that middle blue line at the bottom. And you can get 73 kilometres-ish charge per hour at that number. So 11 kilowatts is quite a nice number to have if you have a three-phase house. Wouldn't surprise me if into the future houses start moving to three-phase, because it balances the load across all three phases, and the grid would be happier for it, rather than a whole bunch of cars turning on their charges at 7.4 on a single phase. So we shall see when that managed grid starts happening, whether supply authorities start encouraging three-phase connections. Who knows? My crystal ball's getting a bit cloudy at that stage, but it sort of gives you numbers. On the DC side, there's the 50 kilowatt charging at the top, and that'll give you, 300-ish kilometres charged in an hour. So 20 minutes for 100 Ks. My Kona sort of will happily do it. It will do up to 70 kilowatts. It's an older technology car. At that 150 rating, which is what a lot of the modern cars coming out now will do, 6 minutes for 100 Ks. So, if you want to do 300 Ks, 18 minutes. At the biggest, fastest chargers, which even the Ioniq 5, Kia EV6, Porsche Taycans will do 200 to 300 Teslas, being a 220, 250 K range, kilowatt range. You can get 2 minutes at the very fastest rates for 200 Ks. The Hyundai Ioniq 5, for instance, will do a 0 to 80% charge in 18 minutes, and that will give you about 350 Ks range. So that's pretty fast. And they only do use those charges when you're going interstate. So at 18 minutes, that's probably less than a cup of coffee in a toilet stop. Often I get the question as well, how fast can I go on a charge? Range estimates depends on what standard has been used. And showing you three there, I'll give you an explanation of each in a moment. There's NEDC, WLTP, and the US EPA. First up, NEDC, the old European standard, which I suggest stands for not even darn close. They're about 30% too high. The manufacturers all learnt to game the system and stay within the rules, but still come up with just rubber numbers, as opposed to VW, who completely threw out the rule book and just decided to make it up when they got caught with Dieselgate. But that's another story we can spend time on later on, another day. So yes, not even darn close. My Hyundai Kona under NEDC is suggested to be 557. And I'd be pretty lucky to get there, although it's pretty good. The next one, the WLTP standard, is a new standard that came out in Europe 6 years ago, and it's pretty close. Their European driving tends to be more suburban and outer suburban driving, so probably not much over 80 Ks at any time. Have a little bit of freeway driving in their test cycle. So if you're driving that sort of stuff around Melbourne, I find with my Kona, I can comfortably do more than that 484. I've seen and have done 500 Ks in my Kona. So WLTP is quite achievable around town. If you're doing a lot of highway work, the US EPA number is biased more towards higher speed and more higher speed driving, highway driving, than the European number, as it would be naturally. A bigger country, they do a lot more driving. That's the next one I'll pull up. And it's, if you're doing outer suburban, country, regional driving through Victoria, that's pretty much bang on. I get 400 to 420 driving around Victoria quite comfortably. I would get a little bit under 390, as I'll talk about in a moment, driving across to Perth and back last year. I was getting probably 390 because you cross the Nullarbor Plain, because you accelerate 110 and stay there. It's dead flat, no bends. You do cruise through a few more electrons. So if you really just nothing but high-speed driving, you will get a little under the US EPA, but just be aware of those things. If you're comparing cars to buy, it doesn't matter which standard you use, so long as you use the same standard, and that's something to be very careful about. BYD in particular are particularly bad at actually giving NEDC numbers. Sometimes they quote the WLTP in their paperwork, in their brochures, but sometimes they also show NEDC to give you this somewhat overestimate of the range. So make sure what the test standard is being used and you compare them. You can use NEDC, that's fine, as a comparison, so long as they're all NEDC numbers. But if you want to get something, get an estimate of what you'll actually really do, I suggest, for most people, WLTP is pretty good. The fact sheets that I refer you to a bit later, I actually list all three numbers if they're available. Some cars don't get sold in the US, for instance, so I can't find the US EPA number. Again, there's a Renew edition for those who subscribe to Renew magazine, edition 155, and I've also reproduced that on my website if you wanted to grab that. Cost of running an EV. I picked these numbers. These are NEDC numbers because Australia still uses NEDC. We have still old fuel quality, fuel efficiency standards. Hopefully that will change soon. That's probably keep hearing from time to time that it's supposed to be happening, But the Green Vehicle Guide, that is the source of all this information for cars in Australia, still uses the NEDC numbers. So I'm comparing NEDC petrol Corolla to NEDC Zoe. So because they're on the same test cycle, I consider that a fair comparison. The Zoe will use on that cycle $266 worth of electricity for driving 10,000 kilometres. The Corolla will use about $1,200 worth at $2 a litre. So your fuel saving, around $900. You'll also be saving on services because there's none of that oil changes, oil filters, all that sort of stuff. The fuel cost, so the service cost in my Kona, for instance, is $165 every year for the first 10 years. And that's fixed for 15,000 Ks or an annual service, for which I'm quite happy to have that because it's get my maps updated, tyres checked, brakes also, by the way, don't wear out anywhere near as fast because of that regenerative braking, putting energy back into battery rather than wearing out brakes and pads. However, in Victoria, we have the road user charge, or the better probably called the EV tax. Very personal opinion here, very badly implemented. As an example, if you have a big, heavy, fuel inefficient vehicle, you pay more road tax in terms of fuel excise for driving that versus driving a small fuel efficient car. So people do like to choose their cars on fuel efficiency. When it comes to an electric car, well, doesn't matter if you have the most efficient electric car built or the worst, you pay exactly the same money for the kilometres charged. So that, for one, is one inequity in the system compared even to petrol excise. And the particularly bad system that they implemented to collect it. And so if they wanted to piss off, annoy all EV drivers in Victoria, they couldn't have done a better job than bring it in the way they did. I have no opposition to a road user charge replacing the fuel excise. We need something to replace it. It just needs to be done better than it is done here. So that's my soapbox for the day. So anyway, you'll save roughly $900 if you happen to be into wanting to buy an EV to save money rather than saving the planet, perhaps. Does an EV go the distance? Well, when petrol cars first turned up, it took 25 years for the first petrol pumps. Before that, it was just 2-gallon tins. I think we've already passed that point when it comes to electric cars. That's the map filtered just for DC fast chargers in Australia. It's plugshare.com if you want to have a go at it yourself. You can filter for up to 10 or 11 different types of plugs. And you can see there, you can drive all the way to Cairns easily by EV. I've driven Melbourne to Sydney several times, Canberra multiple times. As I've said, I've driven Melbourne to Perth and back. Apart from that gap between Adelaide and just over the border in WA, you can do fairly well. I got there and back 6 full days with a half day at each end. So I left at lunch on the first day and got home at lunch on the 8th. If I was driving a petrol car to do that as a safe distance, you'd probably do it in 6. So once they fill in that gap in the middle there, you could do it pretty much the same as a petrol car. It took me 3 days to get across that gap instead of what you'd probably do in 2 because it's a 1,400 kilometre gap. So there's me on the start of the Nullarbor Plain heading over to Perth. And there's the stop I had to do at the moment because of that 1,400 gap. As I said, you can plug into any outlet you like if you've got the right charger and right adapters. That's my 32 amp 3-phase capable charger because my Kona only does 7 kilowatts single phase and doesn't do any more. I had to sit there for 3 hours to do the hop between Port Augusta and Ceduna. Once they put in a DC fast charger, that will be much more appreciated. You can do it just as a normal drive. But at the moment, that's quite handy to have that charge if you go off the beaten DC fast charger track. Otherwise, you don't need that sort of charger. If I go through there or the next person I know going through there, I'm going to donate a extension lead because even though it's an outback pub, I felt a bit awkward parking on the footpath to reach it. For the future, well, home charging is 80 to 90% of all charging. So if you've got off-street parking, that's where all you do your charging at. As I said, you can do it at your workplace, you can do it at the shopping centre. So all that AC type charging where the time doesn't matter, you park it and go away and do your thing. That'll all be AC charging. Typical example in one of the council areas near you is the Laverton Community Hub. And I like that photo because it demonstrates several things about EV charging and EVs. One is they don't ruin your long weekend. They also can tow. And that's a community AC charger. The only minor detail is that people haven't really thought through yet how to charge cars when they're towing. It is being thought about now, and the design of charging stations is improving to be able to do pull-through charging. But it's slightly amusing at the moment that they didn't even think of towing, and that was why a lot of EVs, or sorry, go backwards, a lot of EVs weren't rated for towing to begin with because they were a bit lazy to rate them at it. And that might have been part of the reason why they didn't put chargers in that were good for pull-through spots, but it will change. That's the private Tesla network, which, as I said, uses the same CCS2 plug as everyone else now. That charging system, by the way, is in fact opening up to everybody. So that will be around the world, that is starting to open up to be a public network. You subscribe to it just like you do for the EVs and ChargeFox's world, which I'll show some photos of in a moment. NRMA, I love the NRMA. That's been really useful. They've got a really good skeleton of a system all through New South Wales. And in fact, all the auto associations banded together and bought the ChargeFox network, which is the next picture. That is basically like an Ampol or a BP or whatever. And they just are a charging system that you just either subscribe to or wave a credit card at some of the newer ones, and you'll be charged. That's at Barnawartha North, just south of the border, heading towards Sydney, up to Hume. And the NRMA, by the way, has just put a kilowatt hour, cents per kilowatt hour figure, has been free up until the last 2 weeks. If you remember the road network, so the RSEVs, NRMAs, whatever, I believe that will still be free though. As I mentioned a bit earlier, there are bans coming when you won't be able to buy a new fossil fuel vehicle, passenger vehicle. Norway, as I said, was 2025, and they've hit something around 90% plug-in vehicle sales, most of which now are battery electric, and the plug-in hybrids are getting smaller and smaller in number. So I think it's like about 70 or 80% full batteries now. And around the world, it's getting to be 3/4 of plug-in cars are full battery, and the plug-in hybrids are starting to fall off a cliff in numbers. Europe, by the way, actually now has agreed 2035 for everybody, with a few arkings up from some of the German manufacturers, which I think they've sorted out now, but they got a bit cranky. As a result, the manufacturers themselves are starting to see the writing on the wall, and they've set dates. 2025, Jaguar won't build an internal combustion engine car anymore. 2026, Volvo will only sell full electric vehicles in Australia, 4 years ahead of what they plan for in Europe. As I said, Opel will be BEV only. Bentley, Cadillac, Lotus, it's just amazing. A whole lot of them are throwing over at 2030 because they know the end game will be reached for that 2035 date. The end game will be reached before that. Norway was hitting 70s and 80% a year or two ago. So they know that they'll be selling mostly battery electrics, and they need to be building them by 2030. Even General Motors in the US has said 2035, they won't be building anything with an internal combustion engine anymore. Give you a little bit of a rundown on what's coming or what has just arrived here in Australia this year. Those three in red are the first three to go under $40,000. Most people know that car EVs have been $50,000, $60,000, $80,000 for the last few years. The Teslas started well over 100 to begin with, and these ones are now broken at there. I wasn't thinking they would hit it till late this year, early next year, but they have hit it. And with other states where you can get EV subsidies, for instance, in Queensland, it's a $6,000 subsidy. You could get that GWM Aura, including the dreaded AUX, so the on-road costs. So it'll be 43 on the road here. Take $6,000 off, you're going to pay $37,000, so comfortably under $40,000. And so we will start seeing cheaper EVs through the coming years. And there's a number of interesting ones that'll be coming over the next year or so. The Nissan Ariya is an interesting car. They keep putting off its delivery, same as the BZ4X from Toyota, which will also be the Subaru. Again, they keep putting off bringing it here. The Fiat, I believe, has just arrived. So that H1 first half of 2023, I believe, is either on the docks or available to order now. And the VWs will be arriving later this year, and they are rumored to be the first ones with full CCS V2 home and vehicle to grid capacity, even though you won't be able to do it here in Australia yet. I've also been saying for a while, and the next edition of the Renew magazine will have an article on these, the light commercial vehicle segment is pretty much hitting its straps this year. So I had a good loan of a Ford e-Transit a month or two ago, very impressive 1.8, 1.71 to 2-ton van, full electric, and way better than the diesel turbo diesel that's around previously. There's the LDV E60 Ute. I bumped into a couple of people that own them, and they love them. So it's just a boofy ute. If you need a dual cab ute, apparently it's a very good electric ute to drive. The Deliver is on sale now, as is the MIFA 9 people mover, which is a competitor to the Mercedes EQV people mover. Both are available here now. A number of them are starting to come. The eFuso, that from 6 to 16 ton van. Renault Master and the new model Kangoo will be arriving later this year. And those three at the bottom, the middle on the bottom, yes, believe it or not, GM have rebranded the Hummer a full electric brand. So yes, you can buy an electric Hummer in the USA. The Ford F-150 Lightning, they had so many orders, I think it was over 200,000 orders when they announced, within weeks of them opening the order books for it, within a month or two, I think it was. They had to close the order books a while and then work out how to build more of them. And the Rivian R1T is pretty much the new kid on the block, like Tesla was some years ago. It's also a new company, Rivian. They're going through the sort of production hell that Tesla went through when they started up, but they are selling, I think they've built about 50,000 of those lifestyle utes there. A very impressive ute. And I suspect they will sell in droves once they arrive here, which might be around 2025. Another question I often get, and I've sort of half addressed already, when you can afford one, many predictions have been made. 2019, there was a Senate inquiry into EVs here, chaired by Tim Storer. And those are the sort of numbers I was saying. I think we're getting ahead of that already. The battery price is the key, and that's what that figure from Bloomberg there is. They say 2024 prices of a battery will hit roughly $100 US per kilowatt hour of battery. And when they hit that, that will be the price parity for the middle level of petrol cars. And then the battery will get cheaper thereafter. So once they hit that parity point, they will keep getting cheaper. We won't probably see the cheapest and cheerful type cars like the E-Ups or the MG3s, you know, $15,000, $14,000, $16,000 on the road. We might see low 20s as the cheap and cheerful electric car in 3 to 5 years, maybe. My crystal ball's starting to get a bit murky at that stage, and I'm getting a bit tired tonight. So between the tired and the crystal ball getting murky, I can't give you exact numbers on that, but it gives you an idea. By 2030, you pretty much will be able to find an electric car at your price range and of the style of car you want. And as I said before, we now, as of last few weeks, have got 3 EVs under 40 grand in Australia. And that's 6 months earlier than I was expecting even a few months ago. EVs benefit you and the environment quite significantly. One of the things is you don't have tailpipe pollution. So it's very good in school pickup zones or bus depots where you won't have all of those fumes and those quite damaging particulate matters breathing into your lungs. This is a good point that I want to make here. The emissions, even if you're running your car or electric car on the grid, they are significantly reduced as compared to an internal combustion engine car. So if you look at the far right, that grey line there, that sort of carbon coloured line, is the current model Corolla on its city country combined cycle. For driving 10,000 kilometres, you'll put out roughly 1.5 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gases. For driving an electric car used on the grid, so just plug it into a power point and recharge, no using your own solar panels or subscribing to green energy. In Tasmania, where they have mainly hydro and wind, you'll be putting out less than 1/4 of a tonne. So less than less than 1/6 of the already. In South Australia, where they have roughly 50% renewable grid, you'll be putting out 1/2 tonne, so 1/3. Even in Victoria, without brown coal, it's been getting better and better. A couple of years ago, it was just on 1.5, 1.56, so we were just over. Unless you're driving around a city cycle, you were just under. Combined cycle, you were just over. Now, even on the combined cycle, it's under already. Basically, as we retire our coal generation systems, especially Victoria with the brown coal, we will be getting better and better. And you can see it's just the other states are much the same deal. So I'll let you sort of soak that in for a moment. And as I said, if you get solar, running your own solar and charge it during the day and have a charger set up that will only use your solar, and you can get chargers that will do that, you can just say, right, I only want you to work on solar, and it will just ramp the car charging up and down as your solar panels increase or decrease their output, virtually negligible. And also, you don't have all that waste oil, the plugs, filters, oil filters and engine air filters. Brake pads are certainly probably half or less the number of your replacements. although I am actually replacing the ones on my Mitsubishi IMEV that I have at the moment, as well as my Kona, because they got so rusty. Because it had sat around a while, and if brakes get so little used even when I'm driving it, I can't wear the rust off. So I've given up and bought a new set of brake pads and discs. I'll be putting them on this weekend. As for you, well, service costs are much reduced because they don't need much, if any, service now. As an annual check is worth it, and $165 I personally think is a good thing to have someone run a set of eyes over it. Tesla, on the other hand, they don't have a service network. They just have an emergency breakdown system, and the car will tell you if it actually needs some work, and you can take it to one of the few workshops that they have available, because they don't need lots of workshops due to it just they consider that cars don't need servicing and just need an odd little bit of work that a car will tell them when it's needed. Personally, I still prefer that some sort of annual check. I think that's a good thing. Electricity obviously is much cheaper. If you're driving around on grid power, charging at home, it's about sixth to a quarter of the price of electricity versus petrol. Even charging via those charge vault networks, the public DC networks, you might be looking at a half to 2/3 the price of petrol at worst. If you're looking to buy a new car, you'll always have your own particular set of criteria. So I've just picked a few sets of criteria based on how far people will travel. In this case, if you're traveling less than 50 kilometers a day, pretty much anything will work for you. If you happen to be doing an MG ZS with a slightly lower range, it might struggle at 300 kilometers a day, but if you're doing less than that, you wouldn't have a problem, so it would be fine. If you want to buy a Tesla because it uses that really good network that they've rolled out, then maybe some of those other cars where there's no Tesla chargers, which used to be the case in Victoria, where there was a dearth of chargers, well, we're now getting or slowly catching up in the number of chargers. Although in New South Wales, I think they're spending something like $200 million in charging network rollout and support of it. In Victoria, we're spending 20. And I'm not convinced that we have 1/10 the population of New South Wales. Oops, I got up my soapbox again. If you have an approximate budget of 60,000, I mean, you can get a Kona or an Ioniq. You can't get an Ioniq 5 for that. MG ZS is now under 50 for the basic ones, or in the longer range ones are middle 50s. In fact, I've just knocked $6,000 off in the last week or so. If you're wanting to do a comparison of all of those details, you can drop into my fact sheets that are available through the Australian Electric Vehicle Association's website. That's aeva.au/fact-sheets, or use that QR code there. You can actually see, just do a comparison of all the basic features, and they're all on the front page of it. That's just passenger vehicles. There's about 39 available at the moment in Australia. On the back of it, there is a list of another couple of dozen that will be available in the next 6 to 12 months. And there are actually 3 sheets available, although I'll be dropping the 2 soon. There's now a separate sheet for light commercial electric vehicles, and there has been until the end of June a sheet on plug-in hybrids. Now that they're falling off the radar, I will actually be dropping it. So as of August, there will no longer be a plug-in hybrid sheet. So it'll be the 2 sheets for the battery electric vehicles and the battery electric light commercial vehicles. So for each of those ones that are available now, not the ones that are coming yet, because manufacturers have a habit of changing the specifications unexpectedly between announcing a car coming and actually bringing it here. So when they arrive, you can actually download a fact sheet, double-page fact sheet with exactly the same headings between them, so you can do direct comparisons. And one of the details I fill in on those sheets is WLTP, NEDC, and if I can find them, the US EPA ranges, so you can do those comparisons between cars quite easily. Same deal for second-hand cars. When to consider one, there's a whole pile of them around. I'll list a few more on another slide in a minute. You'll have your criteria. You might say $30,000 is my budget. What can I squeeze in? There's a number of options around. For the same thing for the fact sheets. As they roll over to a second-hand model, I actually change the sheet in style to a second-hand model sheet, and I'll list a few things to check on the second-hand cars. So the main one at the moment for that is the Nissan Leaf, for checking either the older Australian ones or the second-hand ones that are coming from Japan. Buying second-hand, there are quite a few options that have been available over the last 10 years, but there's not been a lot. Back in 2012, when I first got my first EV, I think 256 EVs were sold in Australia. In this year, I think we're looking at 120,000 vehicles. So, and that's been doubling in the last couple of years. So there's not a lot on the market. I think it's about 600 or 700 second-hand EVs in the market at the moment. So there's a few around, as opposed to, if you look at carsales.com, it's like 200,000 all up of cars. So few in number, but if you wanted to get one checked, mechanics might be a bit wary, but 2/3 of the car is still a car. It's still got brakes, it's still got suspension, it's still got doors that open and shut and windows that go up and down. It's got 12-volt systems, horns, lights, wipers. All those things need checking, and an ordinary mechanic is still perfectly capable of doing it. It's just the electric parts that's different. So you don't need to worry about oils, wear, engine wear, smoke coming out the back. You're looking for the tests of the battery and drive function. So hopefully be looking for a mechanic that's done the new units for the skill set that they can do for existing mechanics, or the new crop of EV mechanics apprentices that are coming through that would have started late last year, early this year. The qualification was only created the start of last year, so the TAFEs are only beginning to offer it now. But there are a number of apprentices. The first groups of apprentices are now starting. So in a couple of years' time, they will be available, and you'll be able to get your second-hand car checked. One of the tricks with it is you can get app. There's an app for that, as they always say. You can get a battery app and what's called the OBD2 dongle, or just it's a little thing you can plug into the onboard diagnostic port. It's usually just under the steering wheel somewhere. Dongles a little bit specific to the apps, so just read the instructions on the web as which is the best dongle to buy. Dongles can be anything from $20 to $100. And if you're looking at a particular model, it's worth buying one of those. Put the app on your phone, and then it'll talk to it. For Leafs, LeafSpy is a very well developed one. I play with both LeafSpy and Can Iron on the iMove. I'm yet to play with Can ZE for the Zoe. My partner drives the Zoe. There's one for the Holden Volt, so it's a plug-in hybrid, and for the Outlander PHEV. And I believe there's one for the BMW i3, but I haven't found that. I've been told about it, but I haven't actually found that one directly. If you're after more information about how to test and check a second-hand EV, there's an article on in Renew magazine, edition 158, as well as in the Driven website, or on the Driven website. These are the sorts of examples of the older EVs that are around. I've thrown those up because a couple of them you can actually get new batteries for. The Mitsubishi i-MiEV is probably the best example. You can get a battery now that has, originally they came with 16 kilowatt hours of them in them, of battery, and now you can get one that's an upgrade to 30 kilowatt hours and give it double its original range. So instead of 120-ish, it's now doubled to 240. So if you pick up an old i-MiEV cheaply, you could put a new battery in it and get something of the, as I said, something well comfortably over 200 kilometers charged. And the Leaf, the same. There are some aftermarket options starting to become available for charging, swapping over that battery, and that would be about $20,000 for the Leaf, about $16,000 fitted for the i-MiEV at the moment. And the BMW i3 has been around a while, and they don't seem to be having any major battery issues. The same with the Zoe, the Ioniqs are around. So if you're looking at sort of 20 to 30 grand, you can still pick up an EV. You can pick up an i-MiEV maybe for 10 grand and do that, swap over, and you've got a cheap EV with a 240k range for 25 grand. So there are cheaper options available. You can also go overseas through some of the group buying schemes or some of the companies, such as Ion DNA up in Canberra, or the Good Car Company that's doing bulk buys around Australia. The Good Car Company will do those sorts of cars, as well as a few others now. They're starting to source some from England. Points to remember with these, most of the Good Car Company ones, for instance, come from Japan. They do have different specifications to the Australian delivered ones, so don't expect a car that's exactly the same as an Australian delivered one. It will be different in different ways. Good and bad. A lot of the Japanese ones had more specifications, more goodies than some of the Australian ones arriving had. Beware the maps and switches. If you're buying one from a small private importer, the maps and switches may still be in Japanese. Check they have been converted. Good Car Company does that. Ion DNA is fine, but there are some other ones, small private importers that bring in a few EVs along with their general petrol cars that they bring in from Japan. So worth it checking out. It's not that hard to change them. It's just something to be aware of. They do use the CHAdeMO DC socket, as I said earlier, which is a legacy socket now. But the other side of the coin is you won't see much competition for a CHAdeMO charger when you're going for a DC charge. So it could be an advantage. They do use that Type 1 AC socket from Japan. So you will need an adapter. It's not a deal breaker. Just remember you have to spend a couple $100 to begin with to buy an adapter. And also if you're buying a second-hand car, always check that the little portable charger is both in the boot and it works. So yeah, it's always worth plugging it in and make sure it actually does its job. Australian dealers also won't work on private import, or these grey import as they're called, of vehicles. So you'll need to find a mechanic that will work on them for you. And as I said, thus far, there's not a lot of private mechanics yet that are trained up, but that is changing and will change fairly quickly as these new apprentices come through and mechanics start doing the skill sets. So private imports, as I said, just as a reminder, they can seem cheap, but just check there's a warranty. The good car company I know does quite a good one. Ion DNA does one. Just check what some of the others might be doing. What their features, how they're different to the Australian ones, and how you can get a mechanic. So, ask the question, I'm buying one in such and such an area. Do you know of a mechanic? Good car companies say that they will set up mechanics and ensure that there is a local mechanic that can work on it. Find that person's name before perhaps you buy it. Practicalities when you're making that swap. Switchboards, as an electrician myself, if I see one of those old grey federal switchboards, I cringe because you virtually can't add anything to them. They're very hard board to work on. Pretty much old semi-enclosed rewirable fuses like that. It's time to update. Anyway, so it's not really the EV's fault. It's just your switchboard slipped through the cracks and some work wasn't done sometime in the last 30 years. Because they go back to the 60s and 70s. So you might need to upgrade. I've written an article on that, edition 143 in Renew magazine. If you've got off-street parking, good. If you haven't, that's not a deal breaker. You could go to a local DC charger or those local community chargers like I showed you photos of. You could also, in apartments and things, you can start putting chargers in. The recommendation is to have a switchboard installed in the car park area and then run the chargers back to that. And the chargers can be a dynamically managed charger. There are smart ones. One's smart enough that will do that now, that will talk to the main switchboard and wrap themselves up and down and talk to individual chargers as well. So you can have up to a couple of hundred chargers all linked together. And they will say, okay, we've got 200 amps available. We will share that between the 20 cars connected. So they all have 20 amps each. And then when 10 of them get the full finished charging, the other 20 can have a full charge. A full 32 amp charge for it, as an example. The worst case scenario is connecting your EV personal car spot back to your apartment, because you'll start soaking up, or the people that get those first movers will soak up all the excess power that's available in that building, and anyone else that comes along later won't be able to get a charge because you've overloaded the building. It is really important when it comes to apartments to have that separate switchboard and connection to the main board so it can dynamically manage, and that way everybody gets a fair charge. So talking about that, and don't ever run leads across the footpath. It's just a trip hazard, and quite a lot of areas it's illegal as well. Electricity tariffs, for most of us, that's not really a problem. If you are still on the premium feed-in tariff, where it's something like 60 odd cents a kilowatt feed-in, which you're paying 30 something cents per kilowatt hour during the day and 19 at night, like I have, I make sure I charge at night. So just look at what you're paying day and night and just choose, maybe swap providers and get a better tariff for the time that you want to be charging. EVSEs have you can get all singing, all dancing ones that make you coffee in the morning, or not quite, but we'll do it. They can ramp up and down with your solar outputs, things like that. You can set timers, you can have apps so you can sit comfortably home and watch the car charging, or change the charging rate if you want to. So tell it to wait until there's a cheaper rate coming, things like that. There's a EVSE buyer's guide in Renew magazine. It was in September last year. As I've mentioned before, you do the odd adapter. BYO lead is always very handy to have. And if you're charging off the beaten DC track, that portable 3-phase adaptable charger is very handy, and I've used it many times on my long trips. I've also downloaded those same articles to my website, although I would highly recommend subscribing to Renew and getting the magazine. There's always at least one EV article in every one, as well as lots of other really interesting information. The last one, in fact, is a whole issue on getting off gas and the practicalities involved there. To find out more, Australian organisation, I keep plugging Renew, as I remember that myself. There is a couple of issues there that, like checking second-hand vehicles, was March a year or so ago. There's EVs on the horizon. The next edition will be talking about the light commercial vehicles and what's coming and what's available now. Australian Electric Vehicle Association, you can join, or you could in fact just join the forum, which is free to do so. You don't have to be a member, and there's lots of really good knowledge base knowledgeable people there and a good knowledge base to ask questions of. And that's at the forums, ava.asn.au. Some websites, as I've mentioned, the AVA for the fact sheets. You just click on the tab for that. You can go to the Driven for any Australian EV interesting articles. There's lots. We do a lot of work there on what's happening in Australia and how it relates to what's happening overseas. The Electric Vehicle Council, who proudly represent the electric vehicle industry, they have lots of really good information. Just be wary that it is the electric vehicle industry side of the story. So you'll be hearing what the manufacturers prefer you to hear, as well as the EV sales, EVSE salespeople, that type of thing. But there are lots of really good information sources on that website, and lots of really good reports coming out of there lately. And of course, there's my own website where I do. If you're really desperate for some help, I can do a personal EV assessment, a small charge. However, I'm hoping that after tonight's presentation, you won't need to contact me. So this is my way of avoiding that work, because I have lots of other work to do. If you're really desperate, you can contact me for an EVSE assessment or a car assessment. But personally, hopefully I provided you enough information tonight. If you have any burning questions, we've come up pretty much bang on 8 o'clock, which is when I was supposed to stop. So I've accidentally got my timing right for once. EV News at Big Pod, which is also in the chat. I'll drop off the slide share, and I think the conveners will start asking me some questions.
Thanks very much, Bryce. That was brilliant. We do have a few questions here. So first one, where are our authorities up to with household V2L?
Vehicle to load is where you plug in an adapter and then run lead out. So put a 3-pin plug into your car. That's available now. You could set it up to run, some extension leads if you have a power failure. All you need to do is just run some extension leads around, plug in your refrigerator and a couple of lights. So that's perfectly possible now. It's somewhat complicated to use your car as like an alternate generator and change over, like a generator changeover switch. I would recommend not doing that at the moment. The vehicle to home stuff will be available in about 3 years. So if you really want to do it, a couple of extension leads at the moment is good around home or the campsite. In the longer term, the vehicle to grid, the vehicle to home stuff, still a couple of years off, and sort of don't hold your breath, but just sort of wait with bated breath, I suppose, is the answer.
Very good. Question number 2, how would the Corolla figures compare with the 91 RON as per manufacturer recommendation?
Well, that figure I grabbed off the Green Vehicle Guide website. So that was the recommended the fuel that was on the website that it ran on. So that's how I did it.
Very good. Next question. So will installing a home battery on the wall be superfluous? Is it better to save money for an electric car instead? Yeah.
That's a really good question, and rolling my crystal ball to get a slightly clearer view. My prediction is that no, the batteries will still be needed, because if you're not home during the day and it's a slight power failure, or you want to soak up your solar during the day whilst the car's not there, what are you going to do? So you do need a battery of some sort, but batteries will start being smaller. Once the vehicle to grid becomes available and you can charge your car and bidirectionally charge and use it as a battery, your small battery will be available to power the house if there's a small power failure and soak up your excess solar that you produce during the day. And then your big battery will be your car, which either recharges during the day as the bigger battery if you happen to be home, or if you're charging it somewhere else and bring it back, there's perhaps a week or more backup if you really needed it. So the really big power walls and those big systems will become probably redundant, and you'll be putting in maybe 3 to 6 kilowatt hours at home rather than the sort of 10 to 15 that some people are doing now. That sort of makes sense. It just won't be so much need for a battery system at home, for a big battery, but you will still need a battery if you want to go that way.
Next question we've got here, are EVs safe for people with pacemakers?
That's a good question. I haven't really looked into it. I've never seen any warnings on electric cars that say no. So I'm guessing there must be, but that is a guess. It's a good question to ask of the manufacturers themselves. I might actually do some research and write that up as an article for Renew. Oh, sorry, Renew for the Driven. I'll take that one on notice and watch the Driven, and as in look, watch the website, and I'll see if I can get an article going in the next week or two.
I think the source of that question might, because there can be some issues with induction cooking, I think, and pacemakers. So that could have been sort of the source of that question. But yeah, curious to know if it's also an issue for, or a potential issue for EV cars.
I don't think it would be, because they would have put it on the listing. It would be an issue with induction charging for cars when they're the contactless charging. That isn't yet available, but that might become an issue then, because that would be quite big induction systems under the floor of the car, just like an induction cooktop. So that will be part of the article as I write it. Thank you very much for the question, and thank you very much for the article prompt.
Next question, where can I find info on towing EVs?
If you want to know what the tow ratings are, just go to my fact sheet. One of the columns on that summary page has all the tow ratings. So that's the first part. If you want to know how well they tow, EVs technically should be a better tow car than a petrol car, for instance, and probably even a diesel, because it's maximum torque, 0 rev. So they will pull much better than a petrol or diesel vehicle. When it comes to range reduction by towing, Rivian say with a fully loaded trailer on theirs, which I think has a 2 or 4 ton rating, it drops the range by about 50%, because the EVs are very efficient. It's actually not the weight, it's the aerodynamics of what you're towing that will actually reduce the range. I've had a small trailer on my car until Hyundai finally said we will not allow towing at all, even though they had promised to rate it for towing. So I took the tow bar off again. But I towed a small luggage trailer with it, and it's sitting behind my car at 100 kilometers an hour. It might take 10% off the range. I would watch it and see. But if I loaded up the roof with ladders and planks and did that same trip, I lost about 30% of the range. The aerodynamics is the big thing. So if you have an aerodynamic block of flats caravan behind you, you will knock heaps off. Same as towing it with a big Land Cruiser diesel. It just knocks heaps off if you're towing a block of flats at speed. But it's aerodynamic, like a teardrop or caravan, that type of thing, and it's small and lightweight. It's not going to knock a lot off.
Very good. Next question I've got here is in relation to battery deterioration. So is this how much of an issue is this for electric vehicles, and what's the solution?
It's turning into not being a big issue. The early Leafs gave battery degradation a bad name because their first battery chemistries weren't that flash, and they still build the Leaf with no thermal regulation. So if you get it too hot, the batteries will degrade faster. But they've also found that even in the original Leafs, most of those batteries are still in the cars. So what they thought would happen, they're replacing the batteries sooner than now. They find most of the batteries are still there. So the recycling systems are taking a while to develop because they haven't actually got the numbers to replace them with. All the batteries since then in every other car are thermally managed. In fact, most of them have coolant systems flowing through them. So the batteries are very well temperature controlled. Tesla say, and the data that is coming out now, so the older Teslas, 0.5 to 1% degradation per year. So after 10 years, you have lost between 5 and 10%. So put that in real numbers. A 500k range Tesla will in 10 years' time have lost 5% to 10% or 25 to 50 kilometers, which for most people, they're not even going to notice. It's just recharge it one day earlier, a fortnight. And even then, when the batteries do come to replacing, might be 10, 12, 15 years maybe, or when they pull them out of the car when it's finally scrapped, those batteries still have a second life in storage systems. So Renault, for instance, use the old Zoe batteries in big megawatt storage systems in their factories, and they'll last another 10 years or more in that situation before they go then into recycling. So the battery might last 20, 25 years, then be recycled, and they say they're about 93 to 96% recyclable.
Very good. I've got a question here about sort of relates to what we've just been discussing. So the different charging processes, I guess this question sort of seems to relate to fast charging versus just charging for, a quick charge at home before heading out somewhere. How much does this, variability affect battery life?
They're also finding like Teslas that were used for taxis that they would fast charge all the time. They didn't seem to degrade it very much. It was back to that leaf issue. If you DC fast charged them a lot, the batteries got hot. As a result, the battery degraded faster, and they had some warranty replacements as a result. People killed the batteries. There was a thing called Batterygate with the, I think it was a 40 kilowatt hour battery, so the slightly later version. They decided to, you could DC fast charge it once, and then if you're doing a, say, Melbourne to Sydney trip, the second DC fast charge, it would throttle it back from its maximum of about 40 odd kilowatt hours to about 15, because it just tried to keep the battery cool. So if you try to do more than one DC fast charge in a trip, you end up waiting a very long time at the second DC fast charge. Like Chargergate, I think that was called. Look that up on the web. I think they've improved that now. But I know someone who got caught out recently that they hadn't updated the software or something, and the second charge was a lot slower than the first. But all the other manufacturers, I've done Melbourne to Sydney in 2 stops as far as recharging. 3 stops on the way, 2 stops of recharging.
Yeah, but a colleague
same time for every recharge.
Done the same. Okay, next question. What is the recommendation if I were to buy an SUV for plug-in hybrid versus EV?
Recommendation would probably be SUVs are full battery electric SUVs are fairly expensive still. There's some very good ones available. So if your budget stretches that, they're worth buying. The plug-in hybrids, probably not worth buying now. That technology is becoming a legacy technology and people are stopping buying them. So your resale value may not be that flash in 10 years. And the other side of the coin is if you can wait a couple of years, those SUV full battery ones should have come down in price to something approaching what the plug-in hybrid would be now anyway. So if you can find something that suits you now and you can afford it, there's no reason not to go full battery. If they're not in your price range yet and your current car will keep going for a couple more years, hang on to it. There's no point in scrapping a perfectly good car.
Got a question here about whether or not the presentation will be recorded. That's all good. How do you find the 32 amp sockets in regional areas?
PlugShare. So finding them is look it up on PlugShare, filter for 32 amp charge or 32 amp sockets, and they'll come up. So basically, open PlugShare, you toggle all the filters and say, I want a particular type of plug. In this case, you might say 32 amp outlets. Where are they? And they'll pop up, and then you can just click on each one and it'll show you where they are and what availability they have.
Brilliant. I'm going to read this question out. See if you, what is happening with Victoria charging per kilometre travelled? Will this remain in place or will it get larger?
It has got larger. They put it up from 2.6 to 2.8 as of July 1 this year, very quietly, didn't tell anybody. There is a High Court case still pending the result. It was supposed to be out in April, the verdict, or the judgment, I should say. That hasn't come out yet. So pretty much all of Australia is waiting with bated breath as to what that judgment will be, whether it's legal to charge it state by state or whether it must be a federal charge. I hope it comes down as it has to be a federal charge, and then they may come up with a better system that is more weight and fuel efficiency based rather than blanket charge. As I was saying earlier today to someone, one of the problems with the road user charge is that no matter whether it's the smallest, most fuel efficient EV or the biggest, heaviest, most inefficient EV, they all pay exactly the same road user charge per kilometre. Whereas if you're buying a petrol car and people buy on fuel economy as one of their criteria, then if you buy a small fuel efficient car, you pay a lot less fuel excise than you do for a big, heavy SUV. You might use 3 or 4 times the amount of fuel. So they have to come up with a progressive way. There is an easy way to do it. That WLTP standard, which is a mandated standard, also has a kilowatt hour per 100 kilometre rating. They have to give that. They could simply multiply your road user charge by the kilowatt hour per some sort of multiplier and come up with a number depending on if it's an efficient car or an inefficient car, and you pay it accordingly. And that to me will be a fairer way to do it. Another one, the AVA promoting based on vehicle weight, which is also a mandated number that is always reported through the government. So it's purely their databases come up with cents per kilometre based on vehicle weight. That's another way of doing it. So there are all sorts of ways to fix it, and then the states could collect it with an agreed, sensible way of charging it. At the moment, the Victorian system is the worst of all worlds as a way of levying it, charging it, blanket across everybody. The system of actually paying it is really bad. They won't allow you to argue with it. I was within days of getting my car deregistered because I argued with it, saying they actually miscalculated it by 40%, and they wouldn't back off.
That's very discouraging to hear. I think
I actually might add to that. Other states have said, yes, we will bring one in. We don't know how to do it yet, and we won't bring it in until cars are at least 30% of all new car sales, or maybe 2027. That's New South Wales, so that's South Australia. Tasmania, I think, has also said the same sort of thing. So they're looking at it and trying to work out how to do it. Victoria rushed it in whilst we were in a lockdown, so nobody could protest. It was just, the whole lot was really sneakily done, I suppose, and badly handled. Sorry, I'll get off my soapbox again.
No dramas. The next question I'll go to is it possible to, I guess if you select an electric vehicle that has a battery size, is there the option of increasing the battery size in the future, or are you sort of locked into a battery size depending on which car you select?
You're locked into the battery size. Although not necessarily true. If you buy, for instance, an iMove, you can buy an aftermarket battery, which is twice the size of the original one. And the Leaf, we were saying, instead of 24, you could get a 30 or 40 kilowatt hour battery put in. People in aftermarket situations do it. The manufacturers themselves won't do it, but enterprising people are actually working out how to do it and selling those options. So yes and no. The manufacturers won't do it, but there may very well be options. Although the size of the batteries now, you probably won't want a bigger one.
Got a bit of a curly question here. Can I use an old EV battery, say, to power my home? I've got a feeling that's a very difficult one to answer. So maybe unless we've got a...
I'm happy to tackle that one. There are AS4777 is the home battery standard. Basically, according to that, you can't have a home-built battery system unless it was put in before a certain date. So using a car battery is effectively a home-built system. So no, unless you put it in a few years ago before the standard came in. So I know a lot of people that have home-built battery systems, and they're perfectly legal because they were legal at the time, but you can't do it now.
Interesting. This is probably the last question we have time for. So it's a question about China's transition to EVs. I think I've sort of read a bit personally that it's sort of happening quite rapidly. And it's just a broad question about the reliability of Chinese EV cars.
Well, we all remember the first, if you're old enough to remember the first Japanese cars and how they were pretty rubbishy sort of cars, and they've got to be luxury cars now. We remember the first Hyundais, for some of us. The early XLs and things were pretty crappy car. You know, cheap and cheerful. People loved to drive them. But they basically were a throwaway item. They never looked after them because they were pretty crappy sort of car. No transport. The same thing's happening now. The Hyundais and things are luxury cars. Some of them, they are very well built. I'm very impressed when I bought my Kona, going, it's a very well built car. The ones I had as press cars, the more recent ones, Ioniq 5 and things, are very impressive cars. The Chinese are the same. I drove Great Wall SUV diesel some years ago. I had in the past Land Cruiser trays and Troopies. The Great Wall basically felt like a Troopy with leather seats and carpet. In fact, the Troopy was easier to drive. You look at some of the Chinese cars now, and they're getting pretty good. You're looking at the MG ZS, things like that. They're probably at the stage of a Hyundai Getz. That's and the next generation looks like they're going to be even better. So the MG4 and things, I'm looking forward. I've had a bit of a sit in one. It seemed very well put together, and probably another step up again. So they're just doing exactly the same thing as the Japanese, the Koreans, and now the Chinese. They just start off cheap and cheerful and then get better and better.
All right. Well, I think that's probably all that we've got time for this evening. Thanks very much, Bryce. That was a very interesting presentation. I certainly learnt a lot. Like we've mentioned a few times throughout, this presentation has been recorded and we'll make it available through, I think there's a specific channel on YouTube that we've been uploading it to, so we'll make that available and we'll send that link through to everyone who's signed in tonight, or at least also the people who are unable to make it will also be able to view this presentation a little bit later. But yeah, thanks again, very much again, Bryce. Did you have anything else you wanted to quickly?
I might throw in one question I forget is how much does it cost to replace a battery, because it's one of the things that people say, oh, they're super expensive. The Nissan Leaf battery was originally, when they first came out, the car was about 60 grand back in 2012. The battery was about 30 grand if you need to buy one, because for the first 8 years they replaced it if there was a problem, and they did replace a number of them. My Kona, the new battery for that 4 years ago when I bought it, was about $32,000. I had it recently replaced under a recall because I had 16 out of roughly 70,000 cars have a manufacturing fault that they caught alight. So they recalled 70,000 battery packs. To begin with, they were worth about, as I said, $32,000. When I took mine in to be replaced January this year, the dealer told me his wholesale price was $15,000. That's how fast they come down in price. The Nissan Leaf now, for those batteries that were $10,000 fitted. And that's what happens. They come down very cheaply. So I've heard a couple of trolls come out with, oh, but the Jaguar battery is $70,000. I keep saying, if you buy a Jaguar, the prices of parts Jags are always expensive. So that's a bit of an outlier.
Yeah, paying for the brand there. So yeah.
Don't be getting me wrong. The Jag I-Pace is a very nice car. If I had the dollars, I would quite like to buy one. But it is a very nice car.
All right. Well, yes, thanks again, Bryce. Much appreciated. And thanks to everyone who attended tonight and asked questions. I'll just close it off there. Have a good night, evening, everyone.
And have a good night, everyone. Thank you very much.